The samurai, known for having a long history of valiant deeds, fighting evil creatures and defeating demon kings, but also travelling through time. Well, that's the plot of today's game, as we're going to be checking out The Second Samurai. And welcome to Goldfish on Games. The game was developed by Vivid Image in 1993, and this was released only for the Amiga computers. And unlike the first game, it just goes straight into the main menu, which has a few options but not too many, but it does hint at why this is the second samurai. This first level is all about helping you learn the game. As you'll quickly find some magic books and then get your sword.
My God.
That makes breaking the ground a little bit easier, but it's not required, as you do have a full set of unarmed combat moves. The control system is mostly what you'd expect from a single button game, as it's pushing a direction and the fire button at the same time, and with this you can unleash a whole range of moves, for both armed and unarmed style of combat. And this will prove very useful, as it doesn't take long before we hit our first mini-boss, in the form of this dragon, and you can see its health as it shows up in the middle of the HUD. There are also some sub-levels for you to find, and we can get to the first one that's hidden behind this sparkle, and then after pondering the orb, we are teleported to this room, with a fire imp and these water floaters. Now attacking the imp directly does nothing. Instead, you have to use the floaties to rain down on the fire, which will slowly sap its health. Now as far as I can tell, these sub-levels are mostly about getting extra points, but this one is also about teaching us about that shocked looking water creature, as they can put out fire, and that will be useful later on. The twist to the gameplay continues as we have to ride this bubble car, which will take us to the end of level boss. So this is quite a short, but densely packed level to start the game off. And the second one is mostly more of the same, but it also starts to hint at something that will become more important: puzzle solving. As if you thought this was a mindless hack and slash, then you were mistaken. As we stumble across this idol that we get to pick up and carry. And using this we get to do our best Indiana Jones impression and switch it out for the golden idol that reportedly powers us up. But if it did anything to make us stronger or faster, then I didn't notice it. No, what this does is add to that bar in the middle of the HUD, the experience bar. And it is filled with the white stars that you can see coming out of the floating pots when you hit them, as well as the statue. You would think with it being called experience points that there might be some sort of leveling system or upgrade path. And I think that might have been the plan at one point. But that isn't what we have now, as at the end of each level it will get added to a larger pot, which is then used to determine how much the end game sequence you get to see. Well, if you happen to make it that far anyway. The game is, in no uncertain terms, an absolute stunner, no matter the platform you play it on. The AGA version does have more detailed backgrounds, but really, the original Amiga version still looks lovely, as we can see. For the most part, I'll show the A1200 version of the game, as that's the copy that I have, but I wanted to show the care that they put into the older hardware as well. And for some areas of the levels that you can't see the backgrounds, while the versions are almost identical, they did an amazing job of this. The third level is where I feel the game really comes into its own, as the puzzle elements start to really show up, and this might be the high point of it as well, because you'll find magnets that can lift floors, mini-copters that will help you reach higher places, and then those water-filled floaties show up again. And just at the right time for you to be able to use them to put out some fires. There is also this cannon that you'll use to fire yourself up further into the level, where massive, swinging balls will try and slap you. So you better learn to dodge. But it all ends with another boss fight, but not the most creative one that we've seen, as it's just this three-eyed version of the dragon that we battled near the start, and is nowhere near as fun as the skeleton boss that we had to drop a weight on that we fought against not too long ago. Now that was a fun boss. As the name hinted, you can play this game in multiplayer, and not just one then the other, but in true co-op fashion. And there's even a few modes for how you treat each other, so if you don't want to share the power-ups and health, you don't have to. Or if you wanted to hurt each other, then that's also a possibility, but it does make it much harder. The game also supported you playing it via the mouse port, and that way you could play as the Green Mage in the single player game. The last level of this world can feel a little bit shorter, and this is because the design of the game means that you don't always have to fully explore the maps to get to the exit, as sometimes you might find something a little early on that will take you right to them. And doing that here, well, we'll reach the multi-stage boss fight at the end of this world, and it's this walking plant eye thing. And after a bit of a drawn out fight, we're off to the future, or at least based on the manual. And to check that out, we're gonna have to look inside this very purple box that was used for both the original Amigas and the AGA versions. And you'll need to make sure you have the right one, as there were compatibility issues with the 500 version on A1200, and obviously the AGA version won't run on the older machines. Inside we find the game on 3 discs, and this slightly smaller than expected manual that's cut off the name along the top, and a few pages in we find the game's plot that tells of a mighty fight of the first samurai against the Demon King, who on losing the battle travelled to the 24th century, and after begging a wizard, our heroes got sent forward as well. Now that story doesn't quite fit in with the game, as we started off in the Twilight world, and then we end up in the future. Now it doesn't really make all that much of a difference, as the story, well, it's not really told in game. And the world of the future looks like it inspired the box design, as it is very purple, and we can tell it's the future as there's tanks, which thankfully can be punched or cut. It's also got conveyor belts that can be changed by hitting a switch, but it's just those switches are faces. It's a bit of an odd one really. And what we also have to deal with is crushers. And the future loves to have crushers, with spinning blades on, just to be doubly sure that it will kill anything that it touches. The puzzle solving of the previous levels get pushed a little bit further into the background again, as it's mostly platforming and having to deal with lasers, as well as areas where it tells you, don't fall. And just as you're getting into the flow of things, well, they had to change it up again, and yes, that is a jetpack that lets you fly around the level and then quickly turns into a shoot 'em up. Now I managed to screw this up a bit and turned our hero around, which made it a lot harder than it needed to be. And for the life of me, I couldn't work out how to change the direction back. It turns out you just had to double tap the direction that you wanted him to face, and it would make the switch. I didn't work that out until I was fighting the big flying boss. That would not have looked out of place in a proper shooter. And before we leave this, I do have to say, those backgrounds look lovely. Just look at all of that parallax scrolling going on. Now the next level starts off with some clockwork robots, which doesn't really feel all that futuristic, but for the most part it is a continuation of what we've already seen. More platforming, light puzzle solving, and some really weird creatures that will get in your way. But thankfully there are a number of weapons that you will find on top of the sword that will help you out in the game, but these tend to be limited use. And you'll have seen me use a few of them during the video, like the throwing daggers, or the almost screen and audio filling special attack. With the books you are limited to having just a single one in your inventory, so it pays to be smart at when you bring out the sword, or you use one of those specials. But others like the bombs you'll have a limited number that you can save up and use when you need to. One thing that's not been as present as in the previous world was the mini-bosses, and they decided to change that by having a bit of a mini-boss rush that had this really nice looking effect, and you have to deal with them by punching their attacks back at them. This builds up to a big clockwork robot fight that won't get going unless you let the helper drones finish building it first. And they'll keep trying to do that during the fight as well. So you end up with possibly the most annoying boss fight in the game, as you have to both attack it and the drones all at the same time, because they will keep trying to undo all your hard work. So it becomes a bit of a slog. Now if this game looks different to what you think Second Samurai should look like, then you might have played the Mega Drive game, which I can safely say as it only came out in the PAL regions. Sorry Genesis users. And it looked, and in many ways played, quite differently to each other, as I don't think anything from the Amiga original really got carried over, outside the name obviously. And weirdly, the Mega Drive didn't even get the first Samurai, the SNES got that one instead. One of the core ideas that they did bring over was the 2-player co-op mode. And that second Samurai, well, it's a woman. And it seems they each have their own interweaving planes that they'll walk along, which is quite cool. The levels are more designed around having to hunt down these pots and break them to release the souls, or something or other. And these will break the barriers that end up blocking us. And they get quite creative at where they hide these, as well as how you have to try and get to them. Now being a 1994 release, this was a bit late in the Mega Drive's life, but it also meant they tried to pull off quite a few tricks with the hardware, so it's not a bad game. It actually looks quite nice, but it is quite a different one from what we've been seeing so far. And I also have to say, I'm not a big fan of the constantly respawning baddies that they have on the first level. And with us done in the future, we end up going back to the present day, or at least within the game's timeline anyway. And this feels like where the developers lost a bit of steam, as the levels, while looking absolutely amazing, well, it became much simpler in design, as we start to get these one-on-one beat-em-up style fights. They're more akin to IK Plus or Karateka than Street Fighter 2, and I guess you could call it a mini boss rush if you wanted to, but it does feel a little bit more restrictive after the more open levels that we've played so far. Because it does just lock us in, and then various ninjas will come out and attack you. Now they also have multiple moves and can block your attacks, so it's all about the timing, and obviously there's much less health and weapons around. But you don't have to worry too much about dying, as through the game you'll find multiple 1-ups, and there's even continues. But on top of all that, there's a password system that the previous owner took to heart as they wrote the passwords on the box. The sword also has an extra ability that can help out here, as when you run out of health while you're holding it, you'll gain a few hearts back in trade for the sword flying off. Now this can be a huge boon if you can then defeat the enemy and then find a floor chicken or apple that can restore your health. The sumo boss that ends this level is interesting as you can't attack them directly. Instead, you have to use these jars that falls into the area to send fireballs to attack him. And then we're quickly on to the second level that pretty much follows the first. Now I feel I should mention that the soundtrack to this game is great. It might not always fit, but it does sound awesome. And to make it even better, they mixed in the sound effects as well, so you didn't have to make that all too common Amiga choice. And outside this flying mini-boss, there isn't too much to this level, and before you know it, we're up against the Demon King. The terrifying Demon King, who quickly gets his arms chopped off, and then decides his best attack is to regurgitate his lunch on you. Ew. And then he'll use his eyeballs to attack. Ew. Now normally I wouldn't really show too much the outro to a game, but this was how they envisioned the Demon King looking. A far more menacing looking enemy than what we got. But with that, we are at the end of the game, which I really enjoyed. And I think it might have peaked a little bit too early in the game, but that's just nitpicking, because I had a lot of fun. And it seems the reviewers mostly agreed with me, as it tended to get around 80 to 90% from the magazines. And they, like me, think it was a lovely game that you should go and play. And I think that's where we're going to have to leave this weird land with its two moons. And until next time, I was the Goldfish, that was... Oh no, my God! And this was Goldfish on Games. Thank you for watching this review of an interesting Amiga only title. I hope you enjoyed it and might go check it out. You can also consider using the buttons under the video, as they tell YouTube that you want to see more content like this.